Charlie 1. This is Alpha 2. Enemy armor on the left flank. Adjust fire. Over. That single line of communication, calm, clear, and coordinated, carried more power than 100 roaring cannons. It wasn't a weapon made of steel, but of signal and sound. And in World War II, it was the true secret weapon behind the success of the American Sherman tank. While the Germans had machines of terror, the Panther, the Tiger, beasts of armor that could rip through enemies with unmatched precision, the Americans had something more invisible, and yet more decisive. The radio. Every Sherman tank came equipped with one. Every crewman knew how to use it, and that changed everything. Because in war, the difference between chaos and control is communication. Imagine this. You're a German tank commander in 1944. Your Tiger tank is a monster. 88mm gun, near impenetrable armor, a mechanical masterpiece. But inside your machine, your radio either doesn't work or doesn't exist. You rely on hand signals, flags, or shouting across battlefield noise. Every order is delayed by seconds, sometimes minutes. And in those seconds, the enemy moves, flanks, and fires. Now switch sides. You're an American tank commander inside a Sherman. Your headset buzzes to life. Voices of Allied units, artillery, and air support flowing in. You hear warnings, commands, updates, all in real time. You call in a position. You coordinate with infantry. You flank before the enemy even knows you've moved. That's not just technology, that's battlefield evolution. The Germans had power, but the Americans had presence. Radio made the Shermans fight like a living organism. Every tank, every platoon moving like one body, one mind. When one Sherman spotted danger, all Shermans knew. When one broke through, all advanced. And here's the hook most people miss. The Sherman tank's armor wasn't its greatest defense, its communication was. Because every coordinated move meant fewer mistakes, fewer ambushes, and fewer lost lives. Radios turned the battlefield from chaos into choreography. A German Tiger might destroy 3 Shermans before being taken down, but for every Tiger destroyed, America could replace it fast and use its radio advantage to win the next round smarter. War isn't just about who fires first, it's about who knows first. And in that game, the Americans were decades ahead. It's said that battles are fought with weapons, but wars are won with information. And in World War II, the Sherman's radio turned information into a weapon deadlier than any gun. Visual suggestion, cut to quick flashes, tanks moving in sync, radio dials turning, operators relaying orders, artillery fire landing precisely where called. The world would remember the Tiger for its strength, but historians know, deep down, the war was tilted by voices, not steel. Because when the world burned in silence, the Americans fought with sound. Eagle 1, this is Falcon 3. We've got eyes on enemy armor, grid 24 Delta. Request fire support, over. The voice is calm. Too calm for a battlefield. But that's the power of communication. It replaces fear with control. During World War II, most people saw tanks as just machines of destruction. Heavy, loud, unstoppable. But few understood that the real difference between victory and annihilation often came from a few words traveling through static. The American Army didn't just mass-produce tanks. It mass-produced connected soldiers. Every Sherman tank carried a SCR 508 or SCR 528 radio, a technological marvel of its time. It wasn't glamorous, but it was revolutionary. This single device gave every commander eyes beyond his own line of sight. He didn't have to guess where the enemy was. Someone else had already spotted it. He didn't have to fire blindly. Coordinates came through in seconds. Contrast that with the German side. The mighty Tiger I tank, legendary for its armor and firepower, often entered battle without radios in all units. Only the command tanks had them. That meant when a Tiger platoon advanced, the commander would have to signal the rest with flags or hand gestures. Primitive, slow, and dangerously visible. Imagine trying to coordinate maneuvers in the middle of an artillery barrage using hand signals. One wrong movement, and the whole formation collapses. That's what the Americans exploited. The Sherman crews used their radios not just for survival, but for synchronization. They moved like a school of fish, shifting direction instantly. The moment an enemy was spotted by one tank, every Sherman in the unit knew where to aim. This wasn't just tactical, it was psychological warfare. German tank crews couldn't understand how the Shermans always seemed to anticipate their movements. They thought the Americans had spies or scouts everywhere. But in reality, it was the magic of coordination. The radio also transformed how the Sherman interacted with infantry. American troops could ride alongside the tanks, radioing in updates about hidden anti-tank guns or ambushes. The result was a battlefield that talked to itself, a network of men and machines, all speaking the same language of survival. And here's the unseen impact. Radios didn't just connect tanks, they connected trust. Crews felt they weren't fighting alone. Infantry felt protected. Commanders felt informed. It turned war, the most chaotic human act, into something dangerously efficient. When an ambush struck, the first tank to get hit didn't die in silence. It screamed across the airwaves, "We're hit! Right side! Panzers on the ridge!" That single transmission could save an entire company. Meanwhile, German formations often learned too late. Their first warning came from fire, not words. Visual suggestion, rapid montage, Sherman crews switching frequencies, operators shouting coordinates, tank formations pivoting in unison, artillery rounds landing precisely on target. Information became the new ammunition, and whoever fired it faster won. The Americans didn't just use radios. They mastered them, turning every Sherman into a moving node of intelligence. So when the smoke cleared and history counted the winners, many thought it was the numbers, the factories, the steel. But hidden behind that victory was something quieter, a whisper through static, a command that reached every corner of the front, and a truth that defined modern warfare. The side that speaks together wins together. The battlefield of Europe wasn't just a clash of metal and men, it was a clash of information. Every tank, every squad, every commander was a piece of a vast, deadly puzzle. But while others played blind, the Americans played connected. When people talk about the Sherman tank, they often mock it. Thin armor, weaker gun, a machine that burned too easily. But what they forget is that wars aren't won by individual duels. They're won by coordination, speed, and adaptability. And in that unseen domain, the Sherman was a predator. The secret wasn't hidden in its engine or its cannon. It was humming quietly inside the hull, the radio set. That small box of circuits transformed chaos into rhythm. Imagine two tank divisions approaching each other through fog and destruction. One side relies on shouts, signals, and smoke markers. The other has a voice that cuts through the distance, calm, clear, synchronized. When orders are given, they don't echo, they arrive. When the enemy moves, the entire line adjusts within seconds. That invisible advantage was what terrified German commanders. Reports from the front often spoke of American coordination that seems unnatural. Some even believed the Allies were intercepting their communications, when in reality, the Germans simply couldn't keep up. In an age before computers or satellites, the Americans had created something that behaved like both, a living network of men and machines. But this advantage didn't come easily. Radio operators were the unsung heroes of every armored unit. Sitting shoulder to shoulder with the driver or gunner, they carried the burden of constant communication. Under fire, their hands trembled, voices cracked, but they never went silent. They were the heartbeat of every maneuver. Each frequency had to be precise. Static could mean death. A single wrong number could redirect artillery fire onto friendly troops. Yet they managed it, flawlessly, relentlessly. This communication web stretched far beyond the tanks themselves. Artillery units miles away could receive live coordinates. Aircraft above the clouds could adjust bombing runs mid-flight. Infantry pinned down behind a wall could whisper into a handset and summon armor support within minutes. That's how the Americans turned battlefields into orchestrated chaos. A symphony where every explosion had purpose, every movement had timing. Contrast that with German or Soviet units. Even when they had stronger tanks or better trained crews, their isolation crippled them. A Tiger could destroy a Sherman in one shot, but 5 Shermans, all communicating, could trap and outmaneuver that Tiger before it even turned its turret. It wasn't about power anymore. It was about presence. The Shermans didn't fight as machines. They fought as a collective organism. This realization redefined the doctrine of war. For the first time, Commanders began to understand that the flow of information could decide outcomes faster than bullets or bombs. And so, while newspapers back home printed headlines about tanks and heroes, the real war heroes remained unheard. The voices behind the static, the men who translated confusion into clarity. Their words traveled faster than shells. Their decisions saved more lives than armor ever could. They were the invisible commanders of victory. When history later asked why the Allies advanced faster, why their units recovered quicker, and why their morale stayed stronger, the answer was never just superior numbers. It was something far quieter, yet infinitely more powerful, the constant voice that reminded every soldier on the field, "You're not alone." That was the invisible advantage, not of machines, but of connection. And in that quiet hum of the Sherman's radio, modern warfare was reborn. By 1944, the war had evolved into something far more complex than sheer firepower. Armies no longer fought in neat formations or predictable lines. Every town, every forest, every ridge became a battlefield of shifting chaos. The side that adapted fastest would survive, and adaptation required one thing above all: communication. The Americans understood this better than anyone. In their war rooms, they didn't just map positions, they mapped connections. They saw the front not as a wall of tanks and men, but as a living organism pulsing with information. Each radio transmission was like blood flowing through its veins, carrying life to every limb. When a Sherman crew rolled into the muddy ruins of a French village, they weren't alone. Their radios tied them to artillery, air support, and nearby infantry. The moment resistance appeared, calls for support shot through the network instantly. Within minutes, shells began raining down on enemy positions that had been active only moments before. To the Germans, it looked like the Americans could see everything. But in reality, they could simply talk faster than anyone else could think. Even more remarkable was how this connectivity changed the human side of war. Inside those steel coffins, soldiers began to feel less isolated. They could hear familiar voices miles away. Friends, commanders, allies, all part of the same invisible web. The radio became a thread of sanity amid the madness. A tank commander could check in on his comrades, give encouragement, or coordinate rescues in real time. When a unit went silent, others knew instantly, and that silence carried weight, urgency, emotion. They weren't faceless soldiers anymore. They were voices, bound by loyalty and sound. Meanwhile, German communication remained rigid. Orders came from the top, delayed and fragmented by layers of command. Their tanks often fought alone, relying on outdated methods of coordination. A Tiger crew might destroy multiple Shermans in open combat, but as soon as the fog of war thickened, isolation became their doom. In contrast, American tanks moved like flowing water, adjusting, circling, striking. They had learned the art of fluid warfare, where communication was as vital as armor plating. There were moments when this advantage turned battles entirely. At St. Lo, when thick hedgerows and confusion split units apart, it was the constant radio updates that kept American forces advancing in unison. A tank pinned in one corner could call for smoke cover. Another could flank unseen enemy guns, all because of real-time coordination. These weren't just tactics. They were the beginnings of a philosophy that would shape every war thereafter. That information was power, and those who mastered it could reshape the battlefield without ever firing first. But this power came with a new form of vulnerability too. Every message risked being intercepted. The air itself had become a battlefield, invisible, electric, alive. Engineers worked tirelessly to develop encryption methods, coded signals, and frequency shifts. It was a silent war within the war, one fought not with bullets, but with whispers through static. And yet, amid all that tension, the radio also became a tool of hope. In the dead of night, when the shelling stopped and the air fell eerily quiet, tank crews sometimes used it to send messages beyond orders, jokes, reassurances, fragments of humanity that defied the machinery of death around them. For all its cold purpose, the radio reminded soldiers of something painfully simple: they were still human. Every burst of static, every coded call sign carried a heartbeat behind it. And as the war raged on, that heartbeat, synchronized across miles, became the rhythm of Allied victory. The silence of war had been broken, And once communication had found its voice, the world would never go back. As the Allies pushed deeper into Europe, the landscape transformed into a stage of relentless motion, roaring engines, collapsing cities, and endless fields of fire. But beneath that chaos ran a pulse, invisible yet powerful, a rhythm that orchestrated the madness, the synchronized communication of the Sherman crews. Every battle was like a symphony, not of violins, but of steel, smoke, and static. The radio was the conductor's baton, guiding every note, ensuring each movement was part of a greater harmony. When the Americans advanced through Normandy, coordination became their most dangerous weapon. German defenses were fierce, fortified with anti-tank guns and ambush points. Yet every time they fired, it was as if the Shermans already knew where to turn. A radio report from one tank instantly redirected the others. Within seconds, a defensive trap became a death sentence for the enemy. This precision wasn't coincidence, it was design. Each Sherman operated like a nerve cell in a massive brain, connected to every other by unseen electrical impulses. Orders didn't crawl through ranks, they flowed. Information was no longer a luxury, it was oxygen. Meanwhile, the Germans struggled with fragmented communication. Even when they had superior equipment, they lacked what truly mattered: unity of action. Their tanks were mighty in isolation but blind in formation. A Tiger tank could destroy a Sherman at 2,000 meters, yet it couldn't defend against 5 Shermans attacking from 3 directions, each one coordinated through crisp, radio-driven maneuvers. It was in these moments that the battlefield itself seemed to favor the Americans. The sound of enemy gunfire wasn't just noise, it was data. Reports raced across frequencies faster than shells crossed the air. Crews adjusted firing angles, infantry relayed enemy positions, and artillery responded in perfect synchronization. From above, fighter planes circled, guided by the same network of voices. Pilots could communicate with tank commanders below, coordinating strikes with terrifying precision. The sky and the ground were no longer separate realms of war. They were one connected entity, fused by radio waves. For the first time in history, war had become digitally alive, not in screens or code, but in the living signals of men and machines working as one. And this unity had an emotional core. The voice that crackled through a soldier's headset wasn't just another order. It was the voice of trust. Crews knew someone was listening. Commanders knew their men were still alive. That fragile connection, made of words and electricity, gave courage where fear might have otherwise won. In countless after-action reports, veterans recalled how radio discipline saved lives. In one account, a Sherman unit near the Ardennes was ambushed by German armor at dawn. Within 30 seconds, their leader transmitted coordinates for support. In less than 2 minutes, artillery began to fall precisely on enemy positions. The ambush turned into a retreat, all because of a few seconds of communication. Those who survived called it the voice that saved us. Even as destruction raged around them, that voice remained constant, calm, clear, almost human. And in the chaos of war, consistency became salvation. This communication mastery didn't just win battles, it reshaped military doctrine forever. The idea of networked warfare, born in the muddy interiors of Sherman tanks, became the foundation of modern command systems. Radios evolved into encrypted links, then into satellites, and eventually into digital networks. But the principle remained the same: connect or perish. The Sherman wasn't the strongest tank. It wasn't the fastest or even the most intimidating. But it was the first to truly think as part of a collective, bound not by steel, but by signal. That was its greatest victory, not the cities it liberated, but the future it inspired. Because in war, as in life, those who move together through the noise always outlast those who fight alone in silence. As the war dragged into its final years, one truth became undeniable: the side that controlled communication controlled the outcome. Every advance, every retreat, every decision began and ended with the radio. For the Americans, it was no longer just a tool. It had become the nervous system of their entire war machine. Inside each Sherman, that constant hum of transmission was the sound of evolution. Crews spoke in clipped tones, coded words, and rehearsed efficiency. There was no panic, only coordination. Each man knew his voice could alter the course of a battle miles away. and that awareness turned ordinary soldiers into strategic instruments. By now, the Sherman's communication network had expanded far beyond the battlefield. Radios linked tanks to artillery, infantry, aircraft, and even naval fire support. A single transmission could summon thunder from the sky or precision fire from miles away. This interconnected structure blurred the line between land, air, and sea. It was as if the entire Allied war effort had merged into one unified, breathing organism. German intelligence reports at the time captured their frustration vividly. They described the American army as an entity that reacts before it is even hit. To them, it seemed supernatural. How could a scattered force respond so fluidly? But it wasn't magic. It was information speed, the one advantage the Germans could never replicate. Every battlefield has its fog, the confusion that blinds commanders and isolates soldiers. But the Sherman crews learned to pierce that fog. Through the radio, they shared what they saw, felt, and heard. When a tank spotted movement, every Allied gun within range was already turning toward it. When one fell, others filled the gap within seconds. The battlefield stopped being a place of chance and became a grid of instant reaction. And this network didn't just shape tactics, it shaped morale. Knowing that someone was listening, that reinforcements could be reached with a few words, gave soldiers the strength to keep moving forward. It was psychological armor, invisible but unbreakable. The Germans, in contrast, fought as isolated units. Orders filtered slowly through layers of command. By the time instructions reached the front, the situation had already changed. Tanks that could have dominated the field were instead trapped by indecision. The radio, that small, unassuming device, had quietly reversed the hierarchy of war. And yet, amid this technological triumph, there was an irony. The same connectivity that empowered the Americans also began to change how wars were imagined. Strategy became less about individual heroism and more about systems, about the seamless cooperation of machines and men. The Sherman, once mocked for its flaws, became the blueprint for modern warfare, not because of its armor or firepower, but because it proved that connection could outweigh might. It showed that the most powerful weapon on the battlefield wasn't the tank or the gun, it was coordination. As the Allied forces marched toward victory, their radios crackled with more than orders. They carried the sound of history rewriting itself, in every frequency, every broadcast, every whispered call sign. War would never be fought the same way again, because once the world had tasted the power of a connected army, the silence of disconnection could never return. The network had changed everything. And though the guns would one day fall silent, the echoes of those voices, calm, focused, and unwavering, would shape every military doctrine that followed. The Sherman didn't just survive the war. It outlived it, in concept, in philosophy, in the pulse of every modern battlefield that still beats to the rhythm of communication. When the war finally began to fade and the thunder of artillery gave way to uneasy silence, one truth lingered in the air. Victory had not only been forged by courage or firepower, but by the invisible thread that had connected every soldier, every tank, every front. The Sherman's radio network had done more than win battles. It had reshaped how humanity would fight, plan, and even think about war forever. In the ruins of Europe, among twisted metal and scorched earth, communication had proven itself to be the ultimate weapon. Generals who once drew strategies on maps now realized their real power lay in how fast they could transmit a single order. The battlefield had turned into a vast circuit board, and the Sherman tank, that humble workhorse, had been one of its primary conduits. Historians would later debate armor thickness and gun calibers, but the veterans knew the truth. It wasn't the 75mm cannon or the diesel engine that gave them the edge. It was the voice that spoke through static, the command that arrived in time, the warning that saved entire platoons. The Sherman became a moving transmitter of trust. Its crew members weren't just operators of steel, they were nodes in a living, breathing network of intelligence. When one tank went down, others didn't scatter. They moved with purpose, driven by the constant hum of connection. It wasn't just a battle tactic, it was a new kind of brotherhood. From that system of coordination emerged the principles that would define every war afterward. The Korean War, Vietnam, the Gulf War, all would inherit the idea that victory depended on information flow, not just the size of the arsenal. Satellites, encrypted systems, radar, they were all the descendants of those first brave radio operators inside the cramped hulls of Sherman tanks. That unseen network also reshaped leadership. Commanders began to rely less on proximity and more on communication. They could now control vast operations from miles away, knowing that every word they spoke would ripple across divisions in seconds. The age of direct, physical command was ending. The age of strategic connectivity had begun. Even peace was redefined. When the war ended, those same technologies found their way into civilian life. Radio became mass communication, eventually evolving into global broadcasting, then into the internet itself. The same principles that had guided tanks through fog and fire now guided a connected world through information and progress. The Sherman's greatest contribution wasn't a single battle won, but an idea that human beings, when truly connected, can act with one mind, faster, stronger, and more united than any individual ever could. Decades later, when veterans spoke of those days, they didn't describe the tank's flaws or its power. They described the sound, that familiar crackle of radio static followed by a human voice breaking through. To them, that was the sound of hope. It meant someone was out there, someone listening, someone ready to respond. And in that moment, amid the chaos of destruction, a strange kind of peace existed, the peace of not being alone. Because even in war, it wasn't just steel that held the line. It was connection. The Sherman's radio had done more than guide tanks. It had guided men, through fear, through fire, and into history. And as long as humanity values communication, as long as we continue to speak across distance and divide, that legacy, born in the roar of engines and the whisper of static, will never die. The voice that united 1,000 machines still echoes, unseen yet eternal, reminding the world that the greatest strength lies not in isolation, but in connection.